So yes, I'm Christine. I have a degree in religious studies, primarily focused on Middle Eastern and Southeast Asian. A lot of my work was also in North African. I mostly studied in religions, cultures, and less the dogma, and more the way that cultures interact with their religions, their respected religions, and how the pantheons over time have developed. I have been a Forum RPer for over 15 years at this point. I actually have to update that. I have now been a 5e Dungeon Master for about 7 years. I have also created 2 of my own worlds for my players, in which the fun is nobody's ever finished it, but that's okay. Raise your hand if you've never had a game finish. I always feel better when I see that. Raise your hand if you have completed a campaign. Yeah!
3 years.
Nice. I'm proud of you and your team. 3 hours? I mean, that counts. That does count. Did they finish in 3 hours or did they die in 3 hours?
It's Kobolds Ate My Baby, which is a game that's meant to end quickly.
Okay, so the answer is technically yes. All right, so the first thing I want to make you all aware of is that you probably have Christian culture goggles. If you have grown up in the Western Northern Hemisphere, the culture around you has been predominantly formed around Christianity. Even if you yourself do not practice in the dogma, did not grow up in it, you are not grown up with it, like your family wasn't inherently religious or anything. The way our society works is based around Christianity. The way that we are taught religions and pantheons is based around Christianity. So this heavily impacts the way that you perceive the divine. So some of the goggle blockers is, one of the common ones is that divinity are all powerful and do everything, and they can do everything and be everything. They're perfect, they're flawless. This is really something that comes out of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, especially those monotheistic cultures. There is also the belief that you get only one religion. You can only study one. Especially in capitalist communities, we believe in a box mentality, that you go in this box and this is your thing. There's a science box, there's a religion box, there's a philosophy box. This does not apply to 70% of the world. You also are probably thinking that the only way to pay respect to the divine is through worship, through dogma, through strict rituals. And then the biggest one, which is usually the biggest failure, and that is because of our education, especially if you were educated here in the United States, is you view anything pre-Christianity as old and dead. And more than likely, you've never heard of anything outside, you've heard lightly of anything outside of the monotheistic cultures, but you have been told them in a way that's usually really, really racist. Another thing that you might notice while I give this presentation, I don't like calling them gods. The big reason for this is that God is technically as a name is still very recent. The usage of it came specifically out of teaching from Christian perspectives. The other thing that I like is deity is gender neutral. Also, another thing that I like to use as an analogy is like calling everybody John, because that is inherently what you were doing. Also, really fun fact, because I decided to ask my professor this, our Christianity is kind of the only religion that uses the name in vain sort of mentality. So like saying Jesus Christ is a frustration or God damn it or something like that. That is really unique to Christianity. So it's really funny when I'll see in comics, like one of the most common ones I see with Norse is like Thor's balls or Thor's hammer. And it's like, no, that was never a thing that ever existed. All right, so getting into making a pantheon. The steps that I like to use, in which I'll get into all of these, is first when. You got to figure out the time period of your game. This is a very important part. You got to figure out how many deities you want in there. Do you want monotheism or polytheism? What type of pantheon are you thinking about? Do you want to have what's known as the interactive or the clockmaker? Are they still living in your world? Are they still interacting? Or did they create the universe and then leave? Creation story, my favorite part of pantheon making. How did they start the world? Interacting with cultures, how they interact with your people, how your people interact with them. And then how do your people connect with the infinites? So that back and forth play. Also, I want to make a note, if at any point somebody has a question, raise your hand, feel free to interrupt me. I love answering questions. So, starting off with the easy one. When is your campaign? At what point is your timeline? So, first thing to make aware, the concept of the word religion is actually really, really new. So the idea of I am a practicing X is around 800 years old. The ideology before was not I am a practicer of this specific dogma. It was the world around me works this way. So it was an explanation of your world. So, what is the big ball of fire in the sky? Oh, that's Ra, just taking his journey. And then eventually another one comes over and they do that for eternity. But it wasn't a thing of, who do you worship? It becomes more of who do you like to talk to? Who do you respect the most? Another thing is that connecting with divinity is really, really tied more to a place and a time than than just something that is amalgamous, like a book that everybody carries around. For example, the reason why another Christian culture goggle, a reason why Christianity is so segmented as it is because it no longer has any sort of homeland-based theology. It doesn't have connection to its place. Therefore, it is reliant completely on dogma. A common way that you see this in the opposite is when you have Southeast Asian, particularly the Chinese are really do this a lot, is they have their local divinity to which they bring with them when they move to new places, but it still has that connection to their homeland. Like one of my favorites is there's a Buddhist temple I like to visit up in Carmel, New York, Chang'an Monastery. And they have this really big statue dedicated to a lake divinity that they had in the hometown of where those monks came from. So that is an interesting concept that you can add is, what is the lore of this place versus what is the overarching lore. The other interesting thing is we do this heavily. The idea of the introduction of sciences adds doubt to things because this generally adds a alternative viewpoint and people are afraid of change. It doesn't matter when, people are afraid of change. So you can have habits that older conservative dogma and philosophies refuse to adapt to the change in time. And that can put that conflict together. This doesn't mean that they can't. Again, this is a very Christian culture goggle thing. So, for example, Hinduism. First of all, it's the oldest. It's absolutely enormous. But one of the things that's very common with that is that they have that really good flow of philosophy, science, and dogma, in which it can be, there are new deities that are out now that are dedicated to the sciences, that are dedicated to medicinal health is one of the big ones. I can't remember her name. There are a lot of them. But anyway, that is something you don't have to force. And I see that a lot, especially in more modern day takes of pantheons. So again, the question was, when is your game? The way that I like to look at this is, are you doing pre-science and restricted movement? So is all of your things locally? Are your people not going past a certain area? So the idea is that you have like very local cultures. A good example of this that a lot of people know, Celtic versus Norse. The favorite one I like to identify is that some people in Ireland believe in leprechauns and some people believe in fairies, and they are either different things or the same things. And you can have a leprechaun of one name in one place and then another one in another place. The biggest one for pre-science, which is one of the founding parts of most religions, is what is the afterlife? People are afraid to die. It is something that is going to happen. And a big part of the development of the divinity was to give something to calm you down about what death was going to bring. Or it was a threat. You could have it both ways. Hammurabi's code is a hell of a drug. Could it be something that is middle age-ish? You still have that passing of ideas. You have the development of sciences. You're getting alternative ideas. People are mixing more. You still have a belief divine is meant to explain the world. But you may at this point have the lore of things that are lost to time. The idea that the spoken word, those stories have died out. In which I read a really funny tweet this morning in which people like to talk about that the spoken word is something we don't do anymore. And there was an example of, look, if you have ever known somebody that has worked at a company for 10 years, you know that exists. If Debbie leaves, we're all dead. You also have the idea that organized religion is growing. You have people who are leaders of certain sects, of certain dogmas, which could be a good or a bad thing. Do you want something modern day? The idea of following a religion becomes common tongue. This is usually when you get the growth of atheism and secularism. And again, that is really, really due because you've lost that local connection. You are not connected to your land anymore. Especially in capitalism, we lose our connection to each other, which is another problem. You can also have futuristic. Your local traditions could be dead. There is, no homelands anymore. Everyone is traversing. The best way that you can see this is in space travel. You lose that homeland. You lose that connection to the people. And then it's also this thing that usually appears of you're not looking at the past to give you guidance. You are looking to the future to see what you can do next. And my other favorite is post-apocalyptic. You could have none of the previous beliefs, but usually when things completely fall apart, you start back at the beginning and you're coming up with your own reasons of why the world is there and giving yourself coping mechanisms of what to do next. So, any questions? Any thoughts? Are we having a good time? Nice. All right. So, yes.
With the example of post-apocalyptic, I remember they were reading the story about a really closed-off tribe during World War II that they started drawing like the Mickey Mouse and like different superheroes on their shield.
Yes, that would be an absolutely great example, especially of that taking a thing that you know from your past and you're not connected to it anymore, but now it's divine. It's like, yes, this mouse has, was the owner of all the wealth and all the happiness, things like that. All right. So this is usually where people struggle is how many do you want in your pantheon? There are more than just monotheistic and polytheistic, and this can make things really interesting when you start researching. So monotheism is one all-powerful arching deity. Fun note, Christianity is technically not monotheistic. So you got one. It does everything. Either, and again, this could be they're still around or they are the clockmaker. They established their thing and left. You have polytheism, in which you have multiple divinities of multiple ranks, of multiple strengths. Usually that's a family-based system, or you were born from a cow, like anything like that. So what Christianity actually is monolatry or henotheism, which is you've got one big boss, but there are smaller divinities beneath you. Dualism, which is technically another part of Christianity, which loves to represent itself in a lot of different religions, is you have two powerful forces in conflict with each other. Like it's always that, heaven versus hell, Jesus versus Satan thing. I love seeing this when people put Thor and Loki together, and it's like, no, that's not how that works. And it's also like another favorite one that most people don't know is Set versus Horus. People will be like, yes, this is a very powerful fight. And it's like, no, it's one idiot versus another idiot. Look, somebody tried to orgasm into cabbage to get the other one pregnant, okay? I'm not lying. That's real. Like, that's part of it.
Someone was cut to pieces, including a dick, and then his wife had to find everything.
Yes, but that's a different power story. But you also have the story of, can you row a boat down a river that's made of stone? And Horus was smart and made his boat out of wood and just painted it like rocks. Continuing, but you have Pantheism. So the creator became the universe, and then the consciousness ceased. So it's the idea that it's sort of like the clockmaker, but it is more of the idea that the divinity had consciousness when they made the universe, and now they are part of the universe. So it explains why things function, but it doesn't really have a personality anymore. And then there's a whole lot more. These are just the big overarching ones.
So would pantheism be like Gaia, the Earth Mother?
Yes, that is a very good way to describe it. Another interesting way in which you could look at it, in which it's just like someone who has stepped away, is God in Futurama. Like, first of all, it's a great example of the clockmaker, but it's the other thing of like God became a creator of the universe, and then like they're just the universe at this point. They are no longer a person. The big one I want to talk about is monotheism, polytheism, because this is also where everybody fails. Again, monotheism is you get only one. And of course, you can live in a world in which there are multiple only ones. The idea is you might have demi-deities. They never surpass the main protagonist. The most common example I like to give is, you have Jesus and the saints, but they're still not as high as God. You have polytheism that can be a belief in many deities of equal or different powers. This can range from the domains that they control, where they are in the family lineage, how old they are, and then it could just continue going further and further down the food chain. So an example I have of this is, Zeus is the head of Mount Olympus, but Hera wears the pants and is the one that's honestly running the show. The polytheism analogy. So bad. Treating polytheism like a fighting game. There are a lot of characters with a lot of skills that can do a lot of things, but you only get one. That's it. You only get one. You can only play with one through the entire game. A better one, I hate using these analogies, but it works. Polytheism is like Pokemon. There are a lot of them. They, again, all have different abilities, different skills, different powers. You have your core team. Those are the ones that you like, that you reference to, but you may also decide to interact with others and change up your team or add more to your favorite boxes. Or you just go with whatever will defeat the champion. And then you have the optional DLC. The saints, usually people who are brought up to a divinity state. Not mandatory, but it can really help, especially with history lore building. It can really build up the way that your pantheon works if you're using polytheism. All right, here or gone. This is another one of my favorites. So, how do your divinity interact? Friendly. Usually these are your divinities that are your next door neighbors. They may interact in the mortal world, whether or not the people realize that they are still around, and it is possible to still visit their realm. Dungeons and Dragons lore is heavily based on this ideology that there is, there is no boundaries. You might have the unseen watcher, which is the person who does not interact with the mortals. They may live on a separate plane in which you cannot interact with them, or you have to go through a lot of special things to get up there. Usually might send people down to work on their behalf. And as I mentioned before, you have the clockmaker. Created the universe, created the world, and then left it on its own. That divinity, by your choice, may or may no longer exist. Actually, question here. Who has pantheons who like to interact with their players? Who has pantheons that like to just watch from afar? Who has pantheons that like to mess with their players? Those are my favorite ones. Okay, so for Pantheon building, the creation story is probably the most important part because this is the foundation of not only your world building, but how your Pantheon works, in which I started talking about that. Again, you have to remember that the idea of divinity was supposed to be to explain the way the world works. And so this could be accurate to what your people think, or it could be completely inaccurate and they're making it up on the fly. And your divinity might just be adapting or changing because they can. Or you could be using the structure of, the mindset of the people create the divinity and not the other way around. The biggest thing that this supports is this helps you assign your roles and hierarchy. What your family tree is like, if there are big honchos, if everybody's equal, if one rolls over one domain and one rules over another domain. And of course, most importantly, it explains how things exist. Why does XYZ happen? Why are there storms on the seas? Why does the big ball of fire go across the sky? Why is death? How is birth? What is the afterlife? This can really help explain the way that divinity works in your world, but also how your world thinks of things. Also, creation stories are also just really fun to make, especially when you references like older religions and you decide to take ideology from that. And, you learn that like in ancient Egyptian, the way the world was formed was a dung beetle, or you have parts of Taoism in which the world is technically on the back of a giant turtle. I saw a hand in the back.
Yeah, I was thinking trying to think about that, and I'm like, the creation of I was trying to, the Pantheon, the foundation is how the Pantheon came to be. That not necessarily has to be how they created the world. It might be about how they created themselves. But
that is another good point.
Almost invariably, pantheons like to take credit for everything. So even if they didn't necessarily make the world, they like to say the previous guys made the world suck, so we took it over from them and made it all better. I mean, technically, you can make an argument that's sort of like the Greek creation that depending on how you take a look at it, the classical Greek gods took over from their predecessors because the way they made the universe sucked and they needed to take it over and make it better.
Right. Yeah, I guess actually the better way to put this is not the foundation of your pantheon, but the foundation of your religious lore. Yeah.
I was like, that's sort of like splitting hairs.
It is. But it is like, that is a really good point to make. And I think I'm actually going to add that to my slide in the feature. So thank you. Cool. That is a very simple section. So interacting with culture, again, we talked about how we all like to play with our players, with our divine. But it's also important to make sure how your pantheon or how your religion lore interact with the cultures themselves. So for representing the world, the most classical way is overseeing a physical, emotional, spiritual domains. This is the one that we're most common with because, again, this is how we learned the Greeks. This is how we learned Norse. The big thing that I usually like to advise is less of the control and ownership and more of the divine is that. So instead of saying, okay, my divinity for fire rules over the fire, and it could be like, no, that divinity is fire. Like that is the thing. You can also have physical manifestations or connections with the elements of the world. That kind of rolls back into the last one. And I continue to just roll backwards. Oh, yeah, the other example in which I actually use my game is that, you know, the sea is the home of this place and everything that lives in it is technically their children. Which is always a favorite of mine, is connecting, especially connecting players all the way back to, no, you actually came from, like, you are stardust. You are literally stardust. You can also have the divinity represented in physical figures. We're getting more into the culture-based instead of the formation hierarchy-based. So you can have things like statues and figures, etc. These items may be considered a part of, like, they are actually divine. It's not just an idol. Which is a very bad word to use for this. So the respect that they might ask is, you know, you take care of that object, you bathe it, you dress it, you give it food, it gets its own personal space, it gets its own part in the house. My favorite example of this is, especially in temples that are associated to Krishna. And if you've ever studied anything about Krishna, he is a party boy. He is a child. He is a pimp. He really likes milk maidens. And he really loves butter. But for his birthday, the big thing that happens is you give Krishna on his birthday desserts. Like, that's what you do. You give him desserts. And I was lucky enough at one point to be in a very large temple in PA at one point during Krishna's birthday. And I'm talking about his space was a high school gymnasium. And the floor was covered with dessert. And that was for him. And then the next day, everybody else could eat the leftovers. And that was the way it happened. Another good example that I like to use is I had a professor who got a who was able to, oh God, I'm trying to think of the better language for it. I'm just going to use the word get. A particular statue of, actually no, it wasn't a statue. It was a head of Buddha. And I mean, I'm talking like this thing was enormous. And there was an entire process to which was done in which, you know, there was a ritual that was done in order to help the Buddha sleep. And then there was a process in which we all woke him up. And then when he arrived, we gave him food, he was dressed, he was taken care of. So it wasn't like, okay, this is a statue of this thing. Like, no, this is an actual living, breathing divine. Also, do not ever buy Buddha heads. It's like beheading. It's the same thing. The reason why this one had been beheaded was because it was literally beheaded. You could also have the mortal representation. This usually comes out with the interactions. They may have their own mortal physical form. This could be imagined by the players. It could be literal. It could be fluid. So they could have maybe an elemental state. It technically just said all of that in shorthand. I personally am a fan of the flux, in which the divine choose that they have a true state. Like, this is what they look like. And then there is the facade that they put on when they decide to go down to the mortal plane. or they decide to represent themselves as how mortals perceive them, or a mortal saw them in X form, and then that became the standard. It could be so flexible. And I also love doing that, is how do my divine look in certain formats. There might also be an assumption from mortals, and I already went over this. I'm just reading my slides without reading them. Have fun with that. It's really fun to think about how your divine can be perceived, especially when you're messing with your players. I'm going to take a small water break. Do I have any questions? I'm also going to check my time. Nice. Question.
So I'm trying to make sure I reference things accurately. What's true in like Greece or other things where there might be a main god, but there might be different perspectives or some aspects of that god, like culturally or by almost subdomain kind of.
Yes.
Any advice or comment on using that with the previous slide of referencing this aspect of God or this aspect of divine figure?
Like in a fictional sense that you're making up yourself, or referencing off of things that are currently around, like real life ones?
D&D style stuff, or just pulling out your own Pantheon.
Okay. I would still say the answer is yes. It's just, it could be anything. The world is your oyster. Or a turtle. Or a piece of shit. Anything else? Are we all having fun? Yeah. Okay, so connecting with people. Again, messing with your players. The most common one that we're familiar with is worship. This is a very, very large part of our current dogma that we have around. We assume that all religions of any time have worship. There could be, but it is not required. This could be, it becomes a, you don't have to prostrate yourself to get goodies. That's not the right word, but we're using goodies from your divinity. It could also just be respect. Heck, it could also be that it's just awareness. Cool, you live there. That's nice. I like this dude. And things like that. Usually when you have dogma involved, that is your user manual. But this also goes back to the entire thing I mentioned before, in which you can have the word of mouth that can change the dogma, because Debbie knows everything and the user handbook is useless. Some of the common, most common, especially in older, actually no, it is just the most common. I don't know why I said older. You have a dress code, you have a wash code, you even have a scent code. A lot of people don't know this, especially with Egyptian religions, is scent was a big thing. Aromatherapy actually came out of Egypt. You would have special rooms in which the entire point of it was to bathe and put on the correct ointments for the priests in order to visit the divinity. And then they did the same thing to the statues of the divine. So you could have something like that. In some cases, there is a specific spoken language that needs to be interacted with. This is a big thing coming out of, I'm going to say, Indian cultures, because it's not strictly Hinduism, in which you're only supposed to really learn a particular language in order to do things. P.S. It's actually how you're supposed to do yoga, is you have to learn Sanskrit. You may also have the gift giving that I said before, the accumulation of knowledge, the accumulation of riches, sometimes the sacrificing in order to give lives to the divine. You can have a variety of different rituals. You can put on there how important it is. You can also make it that that's not actually what the divine want. And again, this could be made by mortals. This could be made by the divinity. It could be a mix of things. One of the things that I do advise, because I saw this done really poorly in the implementation of a game, if you make your dogma really, really strict and your players decide to go to that, you are going to be micromanaging them. I don't know if I had that on a future slide. I may have that on a future slide, but I'm just going to give the example. I was assisting with a complete homebrew system, and they were interested in putting religion as a mechanic, like not just lore, but an actual mechanic. And so it was, you had the choice if you wanted for bonuses to choose a divinity, but each one had really strict dogma. So if you decide, so one player decided to choose like the war one, the fighting one, who was like, you know, no mercy, no anything. And so if he did not kill anyone he was fighting, he lost points. And if you lose enough points, you lose your divinity's respect, and therefore you lose all your bonuses. And the amount of like conversation of just the points, like that could be a quarter of an entire battle. It was nuts. Also another thing that I mentioned before, respect and adoration. Again, the idea that deities may not require actual worship. They may not even establish dogma, but it may be that something that everybody in the world respects or hates, that particular divinity. Usually the way that I like to represent this is you are referring to your pantheon like rich neighbors who may or may not deserve respect. Another example of this that I like to use, going back to the Fae things. So my dad's side of the family is from Ireland. And they, as far back as we can look, they have always been in Ireland. And there was a hometown lore, which was a Fae-based lore, kind of. It didn't really have a name or a type. But basically, there was this powerful dude on this hill. And you did not go up this hill. Because the last thing you wanted to do was piss this dude off who didn't want you up there. Was there someone actually living up there? We have no idea. Was it divine? We just knew it was powerful and it wanted to be left alone. So you could have a hill as part of your divinity. You could literally have a hill or a mound or things like that. And you could, if you wanted to, you could also invite the divine into your homes via totems. It could be treated like a family member. Like it doesn't have to be something which is completely separate from the mortal plane. It could be something that is familiar, that is a friend, that is a family member. Again, this goes really far back into your divinity, your lore may be tied to your land more than the dogma. You can also have that mutual understanding. The Pantheon may not be given high respect or praise. They just live on that hill. They could just be up there. You know they exist, but you treat them like, you know, I kind of refer to it as how do you treat famous people? Like, you know them, there might be some that you like, there are some you may be aware with, there may be some you hate, and things like that. This is really, really commonplace in a lot of older societies where, again, the divine was attached to nature, or potentially the working classes were considered too low in order to do actual worship. You know, they usually in those cases, they made up their own practices in order to give worship and respect, because they were not allowed to go to the temples to bathe the actual totems. So again, this could be understanding of their power, but not requiring or demanding respect of mortals. Don't go on the hill. You could also have anything. You could use one. You can use multiple of the examples I gave. World is your oyster. Usually common people are held to a much lower requirement. Again, no, I am mixing up my slides. I am talking about priesthood in this sort of slide. Okay. ADHD is a hell of a drug. So you can have multiple means of connections. This could be based on title. This could be based on family. Usually the way it is that if you're just a regular person, you don't get that same level of importance or interaction with the divine as someone who may be an assigned or voted upon, or they told everybody that they were this close to the divinity. There is, of course, a common element that can happen, and this could be happily abused in your game. People of power may use the divine as a means to control the populace, regardless of if the Pantheon or the divine would actually support it. Again, we're going back to Hammurabi's code, in which the idea of death was used to keep people in line. All right. This is the important slide. Remember, you come from a Christian culture, and this could be some problematic things that you do. Don't steal real life religions. Don't use them. Don't utilize Greek, Egyptian, or Norse and assume that they are dead. These are still religions that are practiced to this day. They may not have the same level of power, but they still have an effect on their populace. Because most people actually don't know how this story worked. The Sphinx. The Sphinx is still revered, especially by the locals, that it is a source of divinity, which can really help with the weather, with crops. It is someone to respect and someone to worship. There was at that time a particular Muslim leader who did not like the fact that the locals, even though they also were practicing Muslims, had that connection with the Sphinx. And so he defaced the Sphinx by cutting off the nose to show everybody that it was just a statue. That's actually where the nose went. It had nothing to do with Napoleon. It was simply a power flex. But again, that's the connection of these things are still being practiced. And the last thing that you want to do is to make a basic assumption of how it's supposed to work. Without those ties to the culture and the foundation of where they come from, you're losing a whole lot of it, especially since you probably have grade school knowledge of it, and Wikipedia is a really, really high level look of it. And in the end of it, it's cultural appropriation, even if you're attempting to use it in the name of fiction. Also, don't go overboard. If you make too much of a pantheon, you yourself are going to forget things. And it could also be overwhelming for your players. But mostly it's going to be overwhelming for you when your players start asking questions. Unless you decide to abuse that and make it the thing of, well, the culture is changing in this point, and people are like, but you said back in this city that it was like this. It's like, but in this city, it's like this, rewriting down what you put. It's like, okay, we're changing it because I forgot. And again, also, a lot of your players are Western. A lot of them grew up in Christian culture. So they may also have the same problems of adapting and understanding this as you have. Also anxiety. Please avoid anxiety. Going back to the avoid mechanics for deities. Mostly I just want to make sure that you guys as DMs and players are having fun with your divinity and your pantheon, and you're not making it into something that the entire table hates. So the biggest problems that come from making it into mechanics is it invokes indulgences, and in which the player only thinks of your divinity as a mechanic and not part of the lore. They're only getting connected to it because it's almost like choosing a race sometimes. I'm choosing this race because I want to get this bonus for dexterity. You start doing that to your divinity as well, and that means that you're starting to lose the lore and that connection with it because the player only sees it as a stat point. And Again, it could also result in micromanaging, unless you are a micromanaging DM. Please don't be that DM. I just realized there's another one on the slide in which I thought of and completely forgot. Also, sir, in the back, I don't know if that's your mask. It doesn't look like you have a mask on. Okay, I just can't see that far. Okay, never mind. Good job. Okay, never mind. It looked like a face from here and I was concerned. It's fine. Don't worry about it. Thank you. ADHD is a hell of a drug. The nice thing too about not relying on mechanics and to just, you can have your players choose where they want their divinity, but maybe you have a stat point bonus. Like maybe there's a thing that you give them. But make sure that is after you get a connection of them to their divinity. And then you can play with it further, especially if you decide to have that interactive elements and you can really get them into it. For example, because he's my favorite player from my game and I can't help it, one of my paladins decided to choose my rock-based divinity Tact as his patron. And we went through an entire first session of how the two interacted, which was he accidentally wandered into the mountain's mouth, that was Tact, and he helped establish his own way of giving respect to this divinity and how he connected with it. Sure, I gave him a stat bonus in which he's really good at identifying rocks. Like, that was a stat bonus I gave him. I also gave him a secret ability in which sometimes when he's in a lot of danger, Tech decides to intervene and a giant fist comes out of the ground. But that's not something in which he chose as having as his Pantheon. He himself actually connected with it and helped me develop him. And that was the coolest part. Bonuses. Here are some things that you can add, which can also be really fun. Mortal representatives is a very popular one. This is going back to some of our hierarchy things. Could there be saints? Could there be a higher religious figure? Possibly a reincarnate, someone who is down the totem pole but appears mortal. You may have their children that walk the mortal world that could be mortal, that could be immortal. It also could be someone who is deemed important directly by the Pantheon's words or signs, signs that they give. You could do this with your own players. Like, that could also be a really cool thing to do, is assign them as a favorite. Whenever you do this, you're going to want to think about how they receive this title. What is the creation story of these people? Because your players are going to ask. They always ask, and they are definitely going to ask about why is this dude so cool? Or why am I so cool? You can also have holidays and natural phenomena. Do you have any events that aren't just the world creation that are tied to your Pantheon? If you have that sort of mortal representative, how and when would the populace celebrate them? How and when would they worship them? Or are there any phenomena that happen in the world? Again, to explain how your world works. Are your volcanoes, is this divine decided, to pop a pimple on the planet? Are there any weird animal activities that come out of it? Could they be connected to the changes of the moon or the changes of the season? And it doesn't just have to be like these big overblown things. They could be small, like, the flowers bloom because the flowers exist because one of your divinity walks across the ground with an open bag of seeds. Another one could be, the reason why this entire weave exists is because the divinity came up with it first and showed the mortal realm. You could also have culture conflicts, which can be fun and also frustrating. So you really have to dance a line with this and figure it out. is there a conflict between, you have opposing forces in your divinity? Is it something like there is opposing forces in the idea of those divinity or the dogma or the lore? It could be I respect this mortal person and not this one, or I don't see this person being the representative and things like that. It could also just be cherry picking for selfish practices. Going back to this could be something, especially if your players decide to choose divinity that fight against each other. You have to dance a very particular line to make sure that they don't murder each other or that you don't lose party dynamic with it. It can work. You just really have to work with your players on that. Okay, cool. That's the end of my presentation, in which I'm 9 minutes early. Yeah. Yeah. Do I have any questions or concerns? I see a hand in the back.
So I have a question on with development of Pantheon set in something like when we're talking about the modern era has things like agnosticism and atheism because of like science being a way to research finding out, the moon is actually just a hunk of rock floating in space. How do you deal with a world in modern times, but the Pantheon is like factual, like you can see it there. Like I feel like that would change the way you interact with it. Like, this guy's shooting fire because he's a god. Would that still be something that's worshipped, or would that be something that would change because of like how research is done in modern era, also future era?
That one I would say is definitely up to the DM or whoever is creating it, because that goes back to the idea of how does your Pantheon interact with people, because that could be something in which the fact is the moon is changed because of this, because it is literally, you could see, or people are aware of this divinity that do it. So you could change that idea. Remember also, don't think of boxes, that this is science and then this is divinity. You can mix them. Another thing, going back to the secularism or atheism. Usually that's a big example of when you get an entire culture who decide that they don't respect the divinity and therefore they don't exist. I can't see it, therefore it isn't real. In my world, I specifically do have a very dynamic Pantheon in which do interact with the realm, and I have an entire huge ass country, and I just cursed, in which is completely atheistic. They don't believe, they refuse to believe in it. And that is mostly being used as a means to manipulate the populace. My dude back here again.
Something that Vince brought up, are there any modern day Pantheons that have representatives that are in charge or represent agnostics or atheists? Because I think that would be very interesting on a sense of religion trying to encompass even the people that don't believe in it.
So that kind of goes into a philosophical point versus a dogma point. But I have seen this. Actually, there are examples of this, which people have probably read before, was because you can see this in Christian culture, which is the question of, if God exists, how would they allow atheists to exist? And the answer was, the person has gotten enough knowledge in order to go through their world safely that they don't need to rely on a pantheon. That's also actually a core feature of Buddhism. Spoonerism is a hell of a drug. Of Buddhism, in which while Buddha himself is divine and there are practices in order to worship Buddha, that worship is more out of respect. And the idea of it is you are being given the path in order to get through your life. I will show you the path, but I'm giving you the lantern to continue. And so the idea of that is they have the lantern and they can walk away from the divine and continue to go through their life subconsciously or consciously of what they have learned. Does that answer it? It's one of those weird philosophical ones.
Right. I mean, it's, there, as it turned into revolution, I remember there's this whole argument that a whole bunch of the revolutionary thinkers were actually deists of various sorts, where they sort of decoupled the thought of God from their philosophy. And I was just thinking that would be a very interesting pantheon, where there's whole segments of the pantheon that's explicitly designed for non-believers, because, because I can imagine certain pantheons that sort of like expand and are aggressive, so to speak, philosophically speaking, that they sort of say, you guys all that don't believe in us, this God is in charge of you, and you're sort of like, what?
No, man, I'm not cool with it.
I'm not cool with that, and it's like the God's sort of like, I'm a God, you're going to be a believer of me sooner or later, and I'm supposed to suck it up and go along.
There's another one that I just thought about, in which could be a foundation for atheism too, in a culture. They don't know it exists. It's not part of the spoken word. It's not where they grow up. They have no idea it exists, and eventually they come and interact with it, and it's like, I don't know about that, but cool story. Also, if you want an interesting example of it going in the reverse, because a lot of people don't understand the going from disbelief to belief and suddenly adding a sort of lore to it. Death in America is a great way to example this. So usually death was a familiar practice. Even in Christian cultures, it was the idea that when you have someone pass, you are with the body, you hang out with the body. But it also was, death was such a common thing in culture that cemeteries used to be parks. Like, that was a place that you could go and have picnics and go on dates. Like, it was a public place that was considered to be part of society in a more secular sense, versus, hollowed ground. And then World War II happened, and the bodies weren't coming back. And so the people started getting a wide fear of death, in which they needed that reasoning. They needed to make it sacred, because it was something that they could no longer connect to without that familiar practice. And so that is when the dead became something more sacred, a thing that you should not touch, you should not be with, because you suddenly had a culture shift in which you couldn't anymore.
I just wanted to get your thoughts on an earlier version of D&D. If you plane shift to a different plane, then your god from your home plane no longer exists. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
I love that. Yeah. That is a favorite mechanic of mine.
Now you have to worship the Dragonlance deities.
I mean, that's also kind of actually thinking about it, Strahd is a very weird example of that too, in which you are separated based off of that. And that's one of those that you can really play with the mechanics too. I also saw another hand over here. Yeah, that one. I will need you to stand.
Yeah, so I was going to ask you about your thoughts with regards not to just, deities and divinities as like these established and like static kind of entities, but like the creation or induction of new divinities occurring within the game. So like obviously, bad guys like of like, well, I want to become a god and remake the universe and whatever, but like, for example, like say you have a player character who is like, I want to become a god, or say, for example, one of my first D&D characters is Patron, is this entity that is kind of godlike, but wants to become a god and become fully real and have worshippers and believers and stuff. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts about the in-game introduction or induction of new divinities.
Go for it. That's something that you definitely have to really work with your players, especially if they are already familial familial with the current D&D Pantheon, but I had a DM who decided to make an entire lineage specifically out of Bahamut in a certain area where there are a variety of different dragons that were technically divinity and had a monk that did rise up to those levels. So yes, go and play with that. Just don't play with the section that says you can use real life. This is what Greek, and don't touch that section. That is the number one thing that I hate that they added to the 5e book. Oh, I didn't know that. Yeah.
5 chapters.
Also, that reminds me, do not make stats for your divine. Do not do it, because the moment you do that and your players become aware of it, their next step is to kill your divine. And they'll do it. They'll do it. I'm gonna grab this dude over here.
How do you go about coming up with names or coming up with what they represent for the god? Because I don't want to just steal or just base something off of something I researched. Or, I don't want to do the appropriation thing. I want to try to come up with something myself. Usually naming something is the hardest part.
So I agree with that. I have in the past referenced other religions in which, in order to get certain sounds of things, my favorite is usually to pull from Zoroastrianism, because Persian is a very nice sounding language. But again, I'm not taking specific words from that. Also, Fantasy Name Generator is really great, and I love that website. But another one that I usually have done, especially with my current game, is make noises when I'm thinking of that divine. I didn't realize until way later that all of my divinity were just one syllable. It took me a while, which all of their names are just one syllable or 2 syllables. But you could, if you wanted, play with it if you know something. So, for example, I have a overarching creator, everything and nothing divine, which is called Soam. And specifically, I got the idea that that is a word that you think of during meditation while doing yoga, because the sound of your breath coming in and out sounds like so-hum. And so that is a common meditation word, and I thought that really fit. And that is a generic word that is meant to represent a noise and not something that's just, this is the name of this divinity. So that was something I like to represent. I also saw the other guy up here with his yeah.
But what about if killing or kneecapping a god is your goal?
I mean, if that's your goal, go for it. It's just a big warning, and I think I think the guy who came out with the initial book of how to kill the 5e Pantheon at the end of it was like, I regret this, because this is all everybody wants to do now. All right. Okay, technically I'm over, but they're letting me stay here, so go for it.
One of the stories of classic cults to the game, when we were mostly talking about D&D, is that they actually did give Cthulhu stats. But the point of the stats was, at the end of it, was that if you do actually manage to disrupt Cthulhu's form, he reforms after 1 to 10 minutes. And of course, somebody says, so what if we nuke Cthulhu? And the appropriate response is, in 1d10 minutes, he reforms, only now he's radioactive. Just to make the whole expression work. And the thing that you learn in Call of Cthulhu is, in order to kill a god, or disrupt a god, or disrupt a god's plan, is never, I have this sword, or you think you need to have the sword of destiny that you needed to have gone on a plot quest in order to get. In order to disrupt the god's plans to grow immortal, you can't have just the right staff. You need to have the right sword.
So there is this demi-deity in Hinduism, which is my absolute favorite, in which he made himself immortal. And the way, so he can't be killed day or night. He can't be killed by weapons. He cannot be killed inside or outside. He cannot be killed by a man or a woman. He cannot be killed by an animal. So he put all of these things in which was like, I can't die because of this. And he was a jerk. And so people didn't like him. So someone figured out another divinity, turned themselves into a half lion, half human, which meant it voided a gender neutral half human, half lion, took that guy into a doorway, murdered them at twilight with these ethereal claws. Like, this is a real thing. Like, this dude went out of his way to be like, you can't do anything. It was like, I have found the sliver of the gray area. But that is a good example of, like, you have to put a whole lot of things into it. But sort of like Strahd, you're going to want to make sure that there are clues involved so that your players, if they really, really want to, can get to it.
The other thing I wanted to bring up was when you were talking about death in World War, after World War II, is also about the time that the commodification of death happened in the United States, right? And that which brings up an interesting question of commodification of your pantheon and your religion. What parts of it are commodified and what parts of it aren't? Like, for instance, if you are a real processor, you use only these fractal fragrances that you can only get from this guy that goes halfway across the world, right? Or whereas if you're just some pup, down the street, you can use cinnamon, right? Whereas if you're the high priest, you're only allowed to use heck. And whether or not those sort of rules are sort of built into the pantheon belief, or whether or not that's something that the culture has added onto it. Because when we're talking in fiction, if we can make the rules being
I need this thing.
pantheon or from the culture, right?
So that is technically,
We can sort of also have certain tensions, whereas some gods are sort of like in the pantheon are much require much less commodification of their worship.
so technically that is a current one that you could look at with a lot of things, and even in older cultures, which could add those levels of, how important you are to the hierarchy. I would just highly advise not putting capitalism in your game, because we already live in this hellscape and we're trying to escape. What? Nope. We're done? Okay. Talk to me outside. There we go. All right. Thank you for coming, guys. Really appreciate it.